Good morning. It's lovely to bring greetings to you from the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Scottish settlement that came out from Scotland to New Zealand was a free church settlement, and they settled in Dunedin. And if anyone knows anything about Dunedin, you'll know that the streets were modelled on Edinburgh. Dunedin was to be the new Edinburgh. And so there are all these lovely connections between us, the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the Church of Scotland. So I bring you greetings from our church in New Zealand, and it is such a privilege to be here in your midst today. And you have made me feel welcome in many ways, including this painting here, or mural, of Tekapo, which is a beautiful lake set in the mountains, the southern Alps that run through the South Island where Anne and I come from. And already twice this year I've made a trip south and gone past that lake, and so it's very familiar to me. I'm going to preach this morning on legacy and destiny. I wonder if you think about legacy and what you would like your legacy to be. There's a well-known saying that goes like this: a society grows great when old people plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit. That's a saying that's meant a lot to my wife Anne and I. Anne is a Christchurch City councillor, and then now as a minister and the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The question of a legacy and a destiny. So what can we do that will improve life for the generations that come after us? And so a society grows great when old people plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit. This is very much Moses' story here in Deuteronomy. There are three things about this for Moses that are relevant here. Firstly, he was very old. In the scriptures it talks about him as he spoke the words of Deuteronomy. He was 120 years old. That's very old. And so here is Moses as a very old man. And secondly, he knows that he has led the people to the cusp of the promised land, but he has been told clearly by the Lord that he is not to go into the promised land. And so he will not sit under the shade of the trees of the promised land, but he's brought the people to the cusp. So what does he want his legacy to be and the destiny of these people? And in that Deuteronomy passage, which is one of my favourites in the whole of Scripture, he has a heartfelt plea for the younger generations who are sitting in front of him. There were only 3 of them at this point who had known slavery in Egypt. They were the older generation. Many of those who were sitting in front of him had been born as they'd gone through the wandering in the desert. All the ups and downs of that journey. And then there were the children who would be the ones who would inherit the promised land. And so he says to the generation who are parents, love the Lord your God with all your heart. This is his plea. This is what he wants to pass on. Love the Lord with all your heart, your strength and your might. And pass it on to the next generation. As you sit, as you walk, as you lie down, write it on your foreheads, for goodness sake, and your doorposts. And so I see here with Moses this impassioned plea that all of this sacrifice that he had made and the people had made to get to this point would not be lost. Would not be lost. I did a funeral recently for a woman who was a strong Christian who prayed every day. At night, her Bible was beside her bed, and in the morning she brought the Bible out to the living area where she would read and pray. She had 5 children who I knew and know very well. And we had a funeral planning meeting while she was still alive. She had cancer and she only had days to live, but she wanted the family to gather to plan the funeral. One of the daughters said, "Mum, you love your Bible so much. When you die, can we put it in the coffin with you?" And she was weak and sick, but she sat straight up and she said, No, do not put that Bible in the coffin with me. You keep it and you read it. It wasn't to die with her. She wanted it to continue to have an influence in the generations to come. And so it is that we have this chain of religious memory that goes back so far. In fact, there's a French sociologist of religion whose name is Danielle Levier, Danielle Levier, and she wrote a book in 2000 that was called The Chain of Religion as a Chain of Memory. Religion as a Chain of Memory. And she talked about the way that over the centuries, going back so many generations, religious faith has been passed on, and it forms a solid chain, a strong chain, so that from one generation to another, the faith is passed on. And you know that here at St. Cuthbert, the parish church of St. Cuthbert, because you've been here a very long time, haven't you? And I see that in your website you say this: the parish church of St. Cuthbert is a lively, vibrant church in the centre of the city of Edinburgh, with roots going back 1,300 years. St. Cuthbert's parish church is believed to be the oldest Christian site in Edinburgh. We have been nurturing hearts for God since St. Cuthbert founded the first church on this site in 670 AD. And so there's this chain of religious memory that is continued from generation to generation on this site. You talk about it as roots going back, nurturing hearts for God. Javier Lejeune talks about that as a chain of religious memory that remains strong, intact, generation upon generation, and therefore fulfilling the heartfelt desire of Moses that this faith, this life-giving faith, would be passed on from one generation to another and kept alive. I come here today as part of that story. In New Zealand, we have this bicultural journey with the Maori, so the Scottish settlers walked into this bicultural journey with the Maori people, the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And one of the things that the Maori people have taught us is the importance of what they call whakapapa, which means to know where you have come from. And so when you introduce yourself in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you start with where have you come from. And so my mihi would start like this: No kotarania toko tupuna. No kotarania toko tupuna. Tupuna means my ancestors. Kotarania, do you know what that means, Kotarania? Scotland. My ancestors come from Scotland. And so I'm wearing the Galloway tie, and fancy a name like Hamish Lindsay Galloway living on the other side of the world, but my ancestors, Galloway, my father's family, my great-grandfather immigrated firstly to Canada and then to New Zealand from Glasgow. And then on my mother's side, my great-grandparents, Mary and George Law, immigrated from Huntly. They had 7 children. The 5 youngest children, including my grandfather, came to New Zealand with them. The 2 oldest daughters stayed here in Scotland, and one of those daughters had a daughter called Jean, who married a man called Leonard Small. And so, Jean Small, do you remember, how many people remember Jean Small? Jean and Leonard, yeah. Jean was my mother's cousin. And so, this connection is strong for me with here. And you know, my great-grandfather and grandmother immigrated to a little South Island town called Waimate and became elders there. And my grandfather was an elder there. And my mother was taken as a young girl to the site of the church that was built in Waimate by the generation who was my grandfather and my great-grandfather. They built the Presbyterian church in Waimate, and my mother was one of those who laid a stone in that church. And I remember sitting in that church as a young boy. I'd gone to church with my nana, Charlotte Dempster. And as we waited for the service to begin as a young boy, I looked up at my nana, and her eyes were so closely closed, tight in prayer. I looked up and I thought, she must really believe this. It had an impact, I remember. From my nana, I remember that. And then my beautiful mum and dad, who were faithful Presbyterians, my mum who engaged in daily prayer, and I saw that, I watched that. And my dad, who was such a faithful worker for the church, they passed faith to me. And so this chain of religious memory is very strong, coming all the way from Scotland, from Huntly, north of Aberdeen, is that right? Yeah, to Waimate. And so in some ways this is kind of like reverse mission as I come back to speak to you today. The problem we have, though, is that the transmission of faith at the moment to the next generation is vulnerable. Do you agree? That the millennial generation and their children are largely missing from our churches. I know the millennial generation well. I've children who are millennials, 3 children who are millennials. I was chaplain at a Presbyterian church school for 21 years. I dealt with the millennial generation day after day. I know this generation well. And they've largely walked away from institutional church. And I was thinking about this because it feels to me that the chain of religious memory as it's passed from my baby boom generation to the millennial generation is vulnerable. It doesn't feel like a strong metal chain anymore. It feels more like this. These are daisies from your churchyard. See that? Did you, in New Zealand, as children, we made daisy chains. Do you know that? You know that? So you make with your fingernail, you make a little hole in the daisy, and then you thread the daisy through, and you can make a chain. But I also learnt from my childhood, while you could make a lovely daisy chain, they were vulnerable to breaking, you know, they weren't strong. And it feels right at the moment that the chain of religious memory from my generation to the millennial generation and to their children is a wee bit like a daisy chain rather than a metal chain. It's vulnerable. And not only is that chain vulnerable, that generation is vulnerable and in need. There's been a huge rise in anxiety amongst the millennial generation in recent times. I was reading in a health magazine that over the last 5 years there's been a 43% increase in anxiety being reported by the millennial generation. And that was backed up by an article in the Sunday Times in New Zealand 3 weeks ago a big article that talked about how anxiety has frozen a generation. And it says this of the millennials: throw together a pandemic, cost of living, housing crisis, and climate change, along with social media and online trolls, and you get a tsunami of anxious young adults. I wondered to myself, is it the same in the UK? And so I did my research on the train coming here this morning. And Deloitte's, for example, last year released some research that was stunning. The research said 50% of millennials in the year 2021 said they feel anxious or stressed all or most of the time. 50%. And so some people in the UK are calling the millennial generation a generation of anxiety or generation anxiety. And the researchers talk about a cocktail of stresses that are causing that. In the paper in New Zealand, it was pandemic, cost of living, housing crisis, climate change, social media, online trolls. I would say here in Europe, you add the war in Ukraine, which is causing anxiety amongst our young people. A cocktail of issues. But I think behind those are some other bigger issues as well, some bigger trends. I would say one of those is materialism, which is fueled by social media. These days, social media knows what we like through these algorithms, and therefore they seek to sell us things that they know that we like, with the promise that if you only buy this, you will be happy. Don't you agree? So social media knows that I'm a mad keen golfer. And perhaps they knew also that about a year ago I had a bike accident and broke both of my elbows. And when I came back to golf, I found that my chipping touch had gone. I wasn't chipping the ball as close to the green or the flag as I had been. And so I got this message to say, here's a miraculous new chipping club. If you only buy this, your chipping game will be absolutely transformed. So did I buy it? Did I? Yes, I did. Of course I did. Did it work? Was my game miraculously transformed? No. It overpromised and underdelivered, and I think materialism does that for our younger generation and for us. Overpromises and underdelivers, but it's a strong, strong trend. A second really strong trend would be the individualism and self-reliance, and in the United States today, the self-help book industry is a $10 billion a year industry. This idea that somehow we can fix our stuff up ourselves. And yesterday, Anne and I were in a bookshop, which is a UK chain called Waterstones. There's this massive self-help section, which is saying that if only we read this stuff and get our stuff together, we can make it. And yet, at the same time as there's this strong emphasis on self-reliance, there are huge issues with loneliness and isolation which have been fanned by the pandemic. And so, materialism and individualism, but I would say the other major trend is secularism, that the millennial generation have by and large walked away from the institutional church. In New Zealand, in our most recent census, there was a huge increase in those who are identifying as no religion. And you can see the trend over the last 10 years. More and more people saying no religion. But when you dig deeper, the majority of those who are saying no religion are in the millennial generation. And research that has come out of the States and has been also confirmed as being true for Aotearoa New Zealand would say that the younger generation does not have a high regard for the institutional church, that 8 out of 12 millennials see us as judgmental, arrogant about truth, and hypocritical. Oh, that hurts. And that even those who come right through youth group, who come through the church, are nurtured in Sunday school and come right through youth group, the research says that 80% of them will no longer be in the church 2 years later. So we have a problem. This is like a broken daisy chain that we're talking about in terms of faith. And yet, the research also says that this generation, this millennial generation, cares about social justice. That this millennial generation is haunted by a sense that there is something more, but they just do not see the institutional church as the place that will answer that question of what is it that gives meaning to life. Which brings me to the New Testament passage, which was the 4 friends who brought the man who was crippled to Jesus. They couldn't get in through the front door, so what did they do? They made a hole in the roof and lowered him down through the roof to the feet of Jesus. And I think about this, I think the millennial generation, who I care about deeply, I'm sure you do too, are crippled by anxiety at the moment and have all these issues that are assailing them, that are causing them to be stressed and leaving them with a search for meaning where they're not just exactly sure where to go, and the institutional church is not somewhere they are going. They're not going to walk in through the front door, just as those friends of the man who was crippled could not get them through the front door, him through the front door. The millennial generation's not going to come through the front door, I don't think so. So they had to find a creative way. They didn't give up. They said, how can we get this man who needs the healing touch of Jesus, how can we get him to the feet of Jesus? And they made a messy decision. It was messy because those roofs were such that when they brought him through the roof, there would have been things falling on the floor around Jesus, and I'm sure the owner of the house and the Pharisees and the Sadducees would be going, for goodness sake, what is going on here? But maybe we need to look for, not give up, but look for creative ways to bring this younger generation to the healing touch of Jesus. And maybe we need to accept that that may not be clean and tidy. It might be messy. There might be some roofs that need to be broken in order to do that. And so, I would say this. Inspired by Moses and this chain of religious memory, and the fact that that's vulnerable today, I'm with the 4 friends who brought the man to Jesus, and that we need not give up, but look for creative ways to engage with this generation who are haunted by a sense there is something more, but are not coming through the front doors of our churches. We need to keep looking for how can we achieve the goal of bringing them to the life-giving message of Jesus Christ. I said that this tie is the Galloway tartan. The other thing I have here is a beautiful piece of panamu, which is a precious stone in New Zealand, and it was given to me when I became moderator, and the design of the panamu here is about not tupuna, which is my ancestors, but mokopuna, who are my descendants. And the design means this: creating a legacy that will bless the generations to come. It might be that we simply hold the ground as a faithful remnant of Christian faith in the Western world today, and yes, that is good, but let us not give up on finding creative ways as well. I'll finish with this. 2009, I was in Jerusalem, and I went to the Wailing Wall, where you place a hand on the wall and you pray, and you put a wee note into the cracks in the wall with a prayer. My prayer was for the generations to come. But as I put my hand on the wall, I had this kind of vision of what Hebrews calls the great cloud of witnesses. I just had this sense, this ancient wall, the remnant of Herod's temple, and all those who had put a hand on that wall in the years that went before and prayed, that I was standing in a line, this wonderful line that went back all these generations. And then I put another hand on the wall and said, Lord, Lord, for the generations to come, may the chain of religious memory not be broken.